Hello and welcome back to Chatbot on Robot Republic with me, Josh or Riku. Today I'm joined by a very special guest because I have Ben, who is the lead developer at Clutch Dynamic Studios, who has been working on a really awesome action platformer called Boris the Sloth. Hello, Ben.
Hello, hello.
How are you?
Doing good.
Awesome. So can you tell our lovely viewership what Boris the Sloth is all about? Because it is a really, really cool game.
So Boris the Sloth is a puzzle platformer with a few new mechanics kind of mixed in. I'll talk about, I guess, probably three of them. The main one is that you can switch between the world of the living and the world of the dead. And while you're in the world of the living, you're kind of like this sloth, more of a realistic design where you kind of crawl around, you can climb trees, you can slash at enemies. And then once you get into the spirit realm, you can move obstacles and kind of set up your pieces to solve puzzles. And kind of part of that spirit realm too has a reverse gravity mechanic. There's also a slow time mechanic built in as well. So you can kind of traverse levels upside down and move trees and boxes and stuff like that around to kind of get from one end of the level to the other to rescue your friend Yuka the koala.
Yeah, and it is. I mean, I played a chunk of it on the run up for this interview, and it's just fun. It's really fun, and it's got quite a nice story as well. We'll get all to that bit in a minute. Kind of like my first question really is, where did the inspiration for this come from? Because it cropped up on our Twitter page for Robot Republic, and it was like, oh, it's about a sloth and a koala and some weird, scary tree monster. How did this come about?
Yeah, so kind of where the game started was probably for about a decade. I've been pretty obsessed with sloths. I mean, they're like my favorite animal. In a lot of ways, they're kind of like the opposite of me. They're really chill and they kind of just lay around. I generally am kind of more of a active person. I always have to be doing something. So I think in a way, I just kind of envy their ability to put things aside. But I've been basically just a big sloth fan, and I started the project in 2020. My wife is from Peru, and I actually moved to Peru to be with her for a little over a year. And part of my needing to work on something was I actually decided to make Boris the Sloth while I was in Peru, basically as a way to keep myself busy. And a big portion of the project for me was to make something, but also I wanted to try to use it to give back to sloths. So actually 100% of the revenue from the game so far has been donated to sloth conservation and research and animal conservation. So that's kind of where the inspiration started, was just love of sloths. Also, my wife loves koalas, so it kind of makes sense. Sloths, koalas. And actually it's funny because you don't really think of them as being really similar creatures, but actually koalas also sleep a ton, and also they eat just plants and hang out in trees. They're actually really similar. So it's kind of they don't seem similar, but they're actually pretty similar.
Absolutely, and they're both adorable as well. I mean,
yeah,
I love sloths. I love every time a sloth meme pops up on some form of social media. I'm like, I love that. That's just great. I love a sloth, and koalas are adorable too. And that's so noble as well. Kind of, and that was something I was going to get onto later in the interview and stuff. But all of the revenue for this is going towards wildlife conservation and sloth conservation stuff, which is such a genuinely lovely thing to do, especially for an indie project as well. It's just so lovely. So thinking about the game then, were there any sort of specific types of games that were kind of the inspiration for this? Because when I was playing it through early on, I was kind of a bit oh, it's kind of old school Mario and Rayman kind of games with the whole 2D side-scrolling platformy stuff, and then there was the spirit realm shifting and stuff as well. I was like, oh, that's a bit interesting, that's new, I like that. Was there any sort of specific types of games you sat there and thought that I kind of want to make something in that kind of area, or was it kind of I kind of like this idea, and this idea, and just kind of mix them all together and went, that'll do?
Well, I personally grew up in kind of the Super Nintendo era, and I basically, when I set out to make the game, I kind of wanted to make something more of a retro style game. So I would say direct inspirations probably closer to Donkey Kong, The one that I get mentioned a lot is actually Lion King for the Super Nintendo, which I did not actually take direct inspiration from. I've only played it like once, and it's probably the game that I get compared to the most, but I definitely did take inspiration from that era, so I'm sure in some way it kind of snuck in. And maybe a little bit from like games like Super Meat Boy, but not like extensively. I did try to kind of think about some of the platforming elements in some of the unique ways, although I've only played like maybe 2 or 3 levels. But I always thought the like idea of that game was like pretty interesting, and it's kind of a more modern version of like the 2D platformer. So
Oh, that's awesome. And I can see, especially in the spirit realmy bit, that kind of some of the platforming in the spirit realm parts of the Git levels does kind of have that Super Meat Boy vibe, with the whole platforming being a little bit more challenging and the kind of difficulty being a little bit higher as opposed to the forest areas and stuff, which I quite liked actually. It was a nice balance in terms of the difficulty curve, which was quite nice. Kind of when you were designing the game then, did you always kind of have this idea that you wanted Boris to be moving between the living and the spiritual realms? Was that kind of like that was like a day dot, my game is going to have this sort of mechanic in it, or is that something that kind of came in as you were kind of ideating?
it actually started out as the original concept was going to have Boris moving between a more realistic world and a more 8-bit world. And if you play Boris the Sloth on Steam, at least, there's also copies on mobile, but if you play the Steam version, there is a setting to change Boris to a realistic sloth. Like it actually looks like a real sloth. The default sloth is more of like a cartoony Boris. And that realistic sloth started because I was originally thinking of going between this realistic mode and this 8-bit mode. And when I was originally kind of working on the game, I just couldn't really get the graphics to work out correctly because it was going from like a semi-realistic mode to like a really pixelated 8-bit world, and it was just very jarring.
Yeah.
And that's kind of when I decided to move more towards the same kind of universe, but going between the living and the spirit realm. And that kind of just helped bring the game a little bit together more visually. And it's also a little bit easier to explain like as a story in some ways, like with how you get from one thing to the other and how you get back. It's a pretty like quirky game in that way. It's kind of meant to not be like super serious or like have it all explained, but that's kind of how that idea kind of transformed over time.
That's really interesting, actually. I have to admit, I haven't kind of like delved into the settings stuff, because the version that I played in prep for this was the Steam version, but I will definitely go and look for that more realistic Boris, because that sounds really cool. Oh, that's wicked, honestly. My next question, obviously, you kind of mentioned that sloths are the kind of, the antithesis of yourself. They're quite docile, calm, will sleep for hours on end, will just, munch on food and nap and everything else. How did you take some of like the sloth's natural attributes, that kind of, that more calm, chilled out, want to nap nature, and link them to Boris in the game? Because there are aspects where Boris is your, stereotypical sloth, as opposed to this kind of action hero and stuff. So kind of how did you kind of go about that process, really?
Yeah, I really leaned more towards some irony on some of it. I mean, like sloths don't attack, but like it would be kind of maybe kind of boring to have like puzzle platformer where you like can't beat enemies. So I went ahead and took some like artistic liberty with that, of course. And then of course, like there's like a dash attack, like that's more of just like kind of funny. Like for me, it's like a fast moving sloth, kind of irony there. But I did try to work in some like things that are maybe a little bit more nuanced. Like Boris moves pretty fast as a sloth in the game, but you'll notice that like there's a daylight cycle in the background that actually also moves pretty fast. So I kind of wanted it to be more like, okay, this is how fast like Boris thinks he moves, but like in reality, it's taking him like a day or two to actually like move just a few feet. And then like the whole like slow time mechanic was also meant to be like kind of ironic. It's supposed to be like kind of like sloth mode. Originally, I actually did call it like sloth mode, but then I was like worried that if I called it sloth mode, like people wouldn't actually understand the mechanic of what it was actually doing. So yeah, I was mostly leaning towards more of like some of the irony of it in some parts, but also trying to like link it back to realistic sloth behaviors. In the like small behind the scene details.
Yeah, I mean, I have to admit, I thought I was just kind of seeing things, to be fair, because when I was playing this, it was kind of like, you know, I played it for a few hours while I was prepping the interview and stuff. I did notice the day and night cycle, and I did sit there and kind of wonder, is that on purpose? And if it is, that's a really, really subtle, nuanced way of kind of just referencing what's going on. But the sloth dash attack is hilarious. The first time I used it, I was, wow, cackling like an idiot, to be fair, because I found it so funny that you're playing as a sloth and you can just move so quickly. I was like, this is great.
And it's really satisfying. I feel like it was really like, once I got it kind of dialed in, it was like a pretty satisfying to like kill a bunch of snakes with the dash.
Yeah. Oh, it was so much fun. So much fun. I was thinking more kind of like focused around the design aspects then, kind of how did you manage, you know, we've mentioned the slowing time mechanic. There's also an altering gravity mechanic. There's a few other mechanics in there, like the sloth dash and stuff. How did you kind of approach the design of those mechanics? Because obviously, like, you know, you mentioned that the slowing time was originally going to be called sloth mode, but you know, I personally think after this interview, whack the sloth mode back in, because people will have watched this and they'll know about it, hopefully. How did you kind of approach, how did you manage the kind of designs of those mechanics? Because they're all quite different from, they're very like, this is a mechanic to do this thing. There's you know, the mechanics are very much, they have a very specific use with regard to the platforming inside the game and some of the combat elements as well. Kind of how did you manage that design?
So when I started the game, I really started just making like a single level and kind of branching out from there. The original concept was really, the two main core mechanics were the world switching and the gravity mode. And once those were kind of implemented into the game and more levels were designed, and I started to kind of shop around the game a little bit and trying to get feedback on it, that's when I actually started implementing the dash mode and the slow mode to kind of add a little bit more. Maybe I think the slow mode really was trying to add a little bit more of forgiveness to some of the platforming, and the dash mode really was just like for the irony of it, because some people's feedback was that it wasn't over the top enough with like the sloth mechanics, and I kind of agreed. So that's kind of how the dash ended up getting kind of mixed in. And then, you know, my main goal when I was designing the game was to try to introduce like one mechanic or one item or a new kind of puzzle per level. And that's kind of why, like, the first level, if you play it, which I'm sure everybody who watches this will, the first level is kind of just more geared about introducing the character and the combat. And then the second levels kind of goes into the world switching, and then the third level goes into the gravity. And then after that, of course, like future levels, once they're introduced, they kind of incorporate those mechanics. And that's kind of why I started with this like progression of like going from the jungle to these other different settings, is because I wanted to introduce different mechanics, and I would try to keep it a little bit interesting and have like a different type of puzzle per level. So that was kind of how I approached that as a like game.
Oh, brilliant. And you know, some of the mechanics in there, I mean, what I noticed when I was playing it through is actually the onboarding, if you will, of the mechanics is done in a really kind of, it's a structured way, but it's not intrusive. So, and that's one of the things that I really enjoyed when I was playing it through. Like, you move to a new level, there's a slightly different mechanic that's introduced, and then you try it out, and then it's like, right, you know what you're doing more or less, off you go and have fun with it, sort of thing. And I quite liked that, because there are some games out there, mentioning no names, that literally just bombard you at the start with all of the mechanics, and you kind of sit there and get to a puzzle 4 levels down the line and go, I don't know what I'm doing here.
Well, when the game started, it actually was pretty much jumping you right in. And it did kind of take quite a few, it did evolve over time, because that actually was one of the hardest things, is to try to get people kind of up to speed quickly. And that took a lot of iterating. actually, that was probably one of the hardest parts of getting the game made, was just like teaching the player how to play.
Yeah, but I think that's an industry-wide concern generally at the moment. Kind of like, from small indie developers like yourself through to like huge, colossal AAA monotonous titans out there. They're all looking at ways in which are best for getting us as players to learn the mechanics in a way that's not intrusive, but also not at the hindrance of gameplay and stuff. And when I was playing it through, I was actually like, this is the onboarding and the way that it's done is really quite nice, because it's not overwhelming, but it's situational. Here is a new mechanic you're going to need. This is how you use it. Right, cool. You've been taught how to do it. Best of luck. Off you go, sort of thing. And I thought that was really, really nice, actually. So kind of thinking more broadly about the game, because there is a really nice narrative core to the gameplay, which is done through some beautiful animation and kind of visual storytelling, along with, other bits and bobs. Kind of, how did you approach that narrative core? Because obviously, you've got this adorable koala and this amazing sloth and this, well, weird. First time I played it, I thought it looked like one of the mandrakes from one of the Harry Potter films. That was like the first thing that came to my mind. I was like, oh, it looks like one of them. How did you kind of approach the narrative of this and kind of like embedding it in a game?
So when I started the project, I did know that I was going to make it about sloths and koalas. So I really started with the primary mechanics. And once I was happy with that, I was kind of just trying to brainstorm how all of this was going to fit together.
Yeah.
And of course, the koala is based on my wife. So it kind of made sense that I didn't want it to be like a hero complex thing, but I did want it to be, that's why it's kind of more ambiguous, that it's more of like a friendship.
Yeah.
Not necessarily like a love interest. And I wanted to find a way to kind of work that in a way that was somewhat conventional, but also somewhat non-conventional. As far as the like mandrake portion, and it is actually a mandrake, it kind of started because I found a really cool like animation figure, like asset set of a mandrake that was already put together by another artist, and I really liked it. And I was able to kind of like use those already like predetermined animations and kind of modify them to what I wanted. But I was like, okay, this actually is like pretty cool idea. The mandrake makes sense because it's like in a forest, and like mandrakes, like mythologically already have some like dream death kind of lore behind them. So that's why it kind of worked out. So I kind of just like took it and ran with it. And I mean, it really just kind of evolved over time. As I would like program levels afterwards, when I was like falling asleep at night, I would kind of just like think, okay, how is the story going to develop, and how do I want each cutscene? How many cutscenes do I want, and how are they going to like progressively tell this story over the course of time? So that's kind of how the whole storyline basically progressed. Was just like I actually didn't even start the game with a story in mind. I actually started kind of more with the mechanics, and then once I was happy with those, I kind of went from there and further developed the story a little bit more.
Yeah, that's really, really cool, actually, because like I know when you're kind of like designing games and stuff, there are the people that do the narrative first and then build the mechanics around the game, and all of a sudden they have a bit of a meltdown because they're like, oh dear, I've come up with something that's way too complicated, and mechanically it's going to be a right pain in the backside. And then the other people that do the mechanics first and then go, right, I've got a really solid gameplay, I'm now going to look at how I'm going to work and weave this narrative through. And that's really, really cool. Thank you. It was, yeah, it's the narrative and gameplay, because there's always, I hate the term, but there is such a thing as ludonarrative dissonance, as many people that work in the media would call it. But I found the storytelling and stuff in Boris the Sloth to be really quite nice. It was there. It wasn't kind of like slapped in your face, but you had these nice cutscenes that kind of just kept everything ticking over, so you knew what was at stake as you move through the game. And I thought that was really, really nice from a storytelling perspective as well. Obviously, we've talked a little bit about the Mandrake villain in the game. I have to admit, I did not complete it. I did not get to the end. How did you kind of you know, was your villain always going to be this mandrake creature, kind of like when you, after you'd kind of done the mechanics and stuff, when you were kind of thinking about the game, were you like, I want to have a mandrake character, or was it more because you mentioned you found these kind of like assets and stuff? Was it in the back of your mind to have this kind of almost, you know, forest plant like enemy in the game, and then you found the mandrake assets and thought actually that works really well? Or was it more of a, I'm going to have a villain but I don't quite know what it is, stumbled upon the assets and thought that works?
I guess it's kind of a mix, because the final mandrake I ended up basically animating, creating myself. Really, the main asset that kind of defined, let me see. So like in the game, you have these like minion mandrakes, and the minion mandrakes are kind of like a smaller and a little bit of a different design. That was actually the original design for the mandrake that I found. And then it kind of just snowballed from there. I kind of was thinking like, okay, if there's like these small mandrakes, then they're probably like a bigger mandrake boss. And that's kind of what influenced like the final idea, was already having these like small mandrakes implemented into the game. And I wanted them to have like some purpose and like some structure in their like mandrake organization, I guess. So that's kind of why there's a different, bigger mandrake boss in the end. Beyond that, there wasn't like a whole lot of thought about like what that ultimate boss would be. It just kind of like evolved over time, like a lot of the aspects of the game. And I think it kind of worked out because, again, I like that it's like kind of plant-based, forest-based, and I think like a mandrake is a great personification of that. And it was always going to be like some sort of nature-based boss. I just like the like kind of organized crime aspect of the mandrake minions and the mandrake boss, kind of all of them working together. And it works out because in the game there's multiple mandrakes per level, so it can't just be like a singular character, you know, it has to be kind of like an organized thing.
That is brilliant. You know, it's kind of like the Godfather but with mandrakes.
Yeah, exactly.
Thinking on kind of a level, from a level design perspective, kind of like, where did these ideas go? Obviously, you know, you start off in a foresty area and stuff, but there is a really interesting mix, not just with the spirit realm stuff, but with the living realm levels. There's a really interesting mix of kind of like different ideas for the level design there. Kind of, was there anything that kind of, because you said you predominantly were working on this whilst you were in Peru. Was there anything specifically that inspired you there, or was there anywhere else specifically that you thought, oh, that would make a really interesting level, kind of like setting for a level or something?
So I mean, from like a personal interest aspect, I think like caves are always like pretty spooky. So in the game, like I do implement like some cave levels. I think like cave, just like exploring in general, always has like kind of a mysticism to it. And that, I mean, in terms of like how the game progresses and inspirations for levels, I would say that it was more about trying to add variety to the different levels. I wasn't specifically thinking like, oh, like a castle level would be more like this in my life or inspired by something directly, but it was more of like, okay, it was kind of like part of the story. I was like, okay, probably this like mandrake can live in a castle, and if I put it in a castle, I can connect it with these cave systems, and I can try to link everything together in a way, and that will make it where the player can kind of explore different systems and have different enemies. I mean, like ultimately, like when you have a cave, you kind of think of bats, so then you can implement like bat enemies, or you can have like one thing that's like pretty interesting in the game is there's like fossils, and you can see the fossils as you go through these cave systems. Actually, one of the fossils is a sloth, a prehistoric sloth fossil. If anybody is like, it's kind of like another nuanced detail.
I was going to say, like, I think the cave level was was one of the later levels that I got to. And the fossils and stuff that were in it, like I saw the kind of like prehistoric sloth, and I was like, oh, that's like a proper like researched one. That's really cool. But that's because I'm a massive nerd and I love, like, you know, dinosaurs and all that prehistoric animals and stuff. I was like, it's a prehistoric sloth. sound really
but
sad.
that, I mean, that was kind of like the inspiration. I mean, like it wasn't like for me, a lot of these like level designs and the progression wasn't really hugely thought out, and they didn't have like these really I don't know how to put it, like direct, deliberate links to specific inspirations. It kind of just like evolved over time as I wanted to introduce more elements to the game and try to have more of an interesting play experience for the characters. And I was able to just like make the artwork out between and do it in like a way that I found interesting. And that's kind of how it evolved. It was like kind of a weird experience, and it's hard to describe because it's so iterative, and it was really just to introduce more mechanics and put the player in like places that like probably are just like very unusual for a sloth, which I think is like kind of funny.
And that came across as well. Actually, it was kind of when I was playing through the game, I was just kind of like, there is a level of underlying ironic humor here that I really kind of associated with when I was playing it. I was like, this is just, it's a bit weird. I think I've got in my notes, I just put brilliantly wacky at points. Because that's what I felt when I was playing it through. I was just like, this is just brilliantly wacky and I love it. It's so fun. Which is nice, and that's what we want from games. We want them to be fun. Thinking about the mechanics then, because obviously there are loads of different mechanics in this game. How did you manage the development process? Because some of these mechanics kind of like, my programming skills are not very good. I'm not going to lie to you. I look at some C# and C++ stuff and just think, I don't understand that at all. I can look at some things and go, that makes sense. Other bits, I'm like, no, don't work for me at all. Don't know what it means. How did you kind of manage that process? Because some of these mechanics kind of must have been quite a challenge to implement and kind of develop.
Yeah, I mean, on the design side, I just organize everything in like a Word document, and then on the programming side, the game is made in Unity, and so all of the mechanics just exist on like scripts, like C# scripts that go on like the player, and it actually does become like, this is the first game I've basically made ever, and so it was quite the learning like process, because it does become very jumbled and there's a lot of like code all over the place. And sometimes when you're going back and you have to like fix a bug, it becomes like kind of a crazy mess, and you kind of like have to like basically relearn what you were doing to begin with. And that actually, the mechanics themselves are, I would say, the initial implementation is probably the easy part.
Yeah.
The hard part is when you like start having playtesters play your game and they go and they start finding like really obscure bugs. So like I have like two pretty funny bugs. Like one was, so in the game you're in the spirit realm, you can like move trees. And so people were like moving trees next to mandrakes, and then they were like going back to the real world, and then they were like climbing the tree and hitting the mandrake while they were climbing the tree. And then when they did that, they literally would just float off into space.
Oh no.
Like the tree and the person, the character would just like float off into space. Yeah, and I was like, okay, that's like the unexpected bug, which is weird. Like those are always like kind of funny. They're like kind of funny actually, like when you see them, and they always happen when somebody's like streaming your game.
Yep.
And the other one was like somebody dropped, also in the spirit realm, like you can pick up rocks and trees. So they like dropped a tree, and then they dropped a rock underneath the tree, and then they climbed the rock and picked up the tree like in the middle of the tree. And I didn't even know that was possible, because like I thought like I had programmed it that you couldn't do that.
Yeah.
And so like my surprise when they pick it up mid tree and then they like set it down in the middle of like the level, and it doesn't make any sense. Like it just looks like it just breaks the illusion of the game. And I think like more of that is like the challenging part, at least on the programming side. I mean, there were some like definitely like interesting issues with some of the mechanics. Like picking up objects and dropping them was probably one of the ones that I had to revisit the most. And probably the second one that I revisited a lot that probably will surprise people was how the Mandrake follows your character and how it kind of warps into the ground and out of the ground. That was actually more challenging, and I had to rewrite the code more times than I had previously anticipated.
I'd imagine there are trigger boxes that are put down that are supposed to trigger animations, and then there are ray casts involved, all the other fancy stuff
basically
that goes into Unity.
Yeah, and it's funny because with the Mandrake, so like in the game, technically enemies could walk off certain areas, so you have to like check for like ledges, because I didn't want the Mandrake to like fall off into the ground and like go through the level and be gone forever. So you have to do these like checks, and when like the player jumps, the Mandrake needs to stop moving, and then when the player lands, it checks for like how far away is the Mandrake, because I don't want the Mandrake to just like warp up and down while the player jumps in place. But if the player jumps over like a spike pit, I want the Mandrake to like warp on the other side of that spike pit, basically. So it's like a really overly complicated set of checks to like move that character along with your main player, and it was kind of interesting.
Yeah, I bet. And that must have been quite a challenge as well, to try and, if there were bugs with that, to then go back and find the exact lines in the code and sitting there going, oh my God, because Unity is, I've used Unity a fair bit for kind of like small projects and stuff, and it's amazing, but at the same time, trying to fix code, I like I said, I don't know what I'm doing. I just look at Unity code sometimes and just go, where's that YouTube tutorial gone?
And that's the great thing about Unity, right, is like there's so many tutorials. And one of the things I did try to do is, once I found a solution to something that maybe wasn't well explained, I actually would make a tutorial. So I have like 2 or 3 tutorials, like mostly about like kind of random Unity things that I search for. And it's like, this should have been more obvious, but it like wasn't. So I'll make a tutorial about it for somebody else, or, that kind of thing.
Oh, that's amazing. I might have to go and check those tutorials out for a project I'm working on at the moment.
they're really like kind of obscure. I made another game, which maybe we can talk about later, but basically it is an all UI based game. And I like had to find, like, I couldn't figure out how to like move things and instantiate things in UI universe for I won't go too deep into it, because Unity has like basically 2 different,
I was gonna say, you've got the
independent, it's like you're getting too into the weeds with it probably, but it's
the very much,
they're pretty nuanced.
There are
tutorials.
2 systems that do very different things. One is specifically for UI, and one is for, well, pretty much everything else. That's really interesting. Thank you, because obviously, what I love about this is being able to kind of like talk about the development process and all the other bits and bobs. My last 2 questions are, well, I've asked them to everyone, to be fair, and most people that are regulars to the show are just like, oh, he's going to ask that one again, is he? Kind of, what have been some of like the big challenges during the development of Boris the Sloth? Obviously, we talked about the kind of the bug fixing and stuff, but have there ever been any other kind of like big things that you've just looked at this and just gone, I just don't even with this?
I think with indie game development, probably I think like almost universally the hardest thing for indie game developers is probably getting their game just like out there. Like, you publish your game and then you have to like advertise it. So I would say that is by far the hardest part. And usually that involves a lot of social media and trying to figure out like, what is Twitter good for? What is Reddit good for? And it's even funny because like on Reddit, like I actually got a ton of my users from Reddit, and but like Reddit is like really sometimes hard to use. And it's funny, I actually got banned from the Sloth subreddit because I was posting too much about my they considered my post spam, even, which is kind of funny because when I was posting there, like the community actually like highly
responded to them, upvotes.
I responded to them and enjoyed them. They were like top posts for the week and the month and stuff. So, but it was kind of funny. So that's like one thing that's like kind of interesting. Is like, okay, you have this game, and what's nice about my game, and it was somewhat intentional, is I was able to post on like our sloths and our koalas and a few of like non-gaming subs, but with the sloth subreddit, it was just like one step too far, and they like permanently banned me. So it's kind of funny.
Sort yourselves out, Sloth subreddit.
Yeah,
honestly.
And it's I mean, it's a great, if you have like an indie game and it has like some subject matter like that, it's like a great way to like get users. You just have to be like really careful. And it's even funny in that case because they usually, the main thing is that you usually want to like reach out to a subreddit mod team and like ask for permission. And I had done that in the past and they said it was fine. It just like, I guess it was like a limited time offer kind of thing, you know? So that's always hard. And a lot of people these days also use like TikTok and Instagram Reels, which I would also recommend for like indie devs. But like that's by far the hardest part, is just like getting your game out there. And then the second hardest part we talked about already was probably the amount of revisions that I had to do for the user experience. And it's just interesting to like see how that evolves over time, because like the original idea was kind of more of a more challenging, more punishing kind of game. I wouldn't say like Souls-like, but maybe like something similar where it's like you make a mistake, it's your mistake that you made and it punishes you, and then you have to like restart the level, and a lot of people didn't like that. So that's actually why some of the mechanics changed. Like I'll give you like 2 examples. So originally when you would eat a flower or attack a mandrake, that was it. You only got to do that for that specific set. Now I tried to eliminate basically anywhere you could get stuck. So now if you eat a flower or attack a mandrake, then the corresponding flower or mandrake will respawn. And that kind of prevents you from getting in situations where you get stuck and you have to like force restart. The other one was just like trying to put Penny's actually my dog. It's actually my actual dog, but Penny in the game is like a life refiller basically. And I tried to put Penny kind of in the middle of each level as a sort of checkpoint. Like if you die, you still have to start over, but like if you are like getting attacked by snakes and then you find Penny, then you can like restore and then you'll be able to continue the level. It makes like the user experience a little bit more level. And that, I don't know, that was just like generally unexpected. I just like did not expect how difficult it would be to make the game fun for people. Like it was fun, but like it was definitely more punishing at the beginning. And also like, of course, we already talked about like teaching the mechanics and like when you spend 1,000 hours making a game, you know the mechanics, and it's hard to like almost empathize with your player until you get play testers and you realize that it's actually like you have to do some redesigns that you didn't expect because of the user experience, which is pretty interesting to kind of figure out.
Yeah, absolutely. God, thank you for sharing that as well, because you know a lot of people on it do kind of, you know, marketing does seem to be the biggest thing, because there are so many indie games out there, but you know, and trying to find your kind of audience and stuff can be a real challenge. But then, you know, the actual development stuff as well can be a real pain in the backside at times, that you just kind of sit there and think, oh, why is this not working? Why is it not working?
And sometimes it's not even just like, sometimes things like legitimately don't work, but also as an indie gamer, indie, I guess, dev, there's just so many subsystems that you're implementing. Like even if they all work, it's just like the sheer amount of actual work that goes into it is like kind of mind-boggling. And I think that was like maybe one of the things that was most surprising to me when I first started this whole process. It's like, okay, I made this game, I made this prototype, and then once you start actually stepping into like having to release like a full-on project from start to finish, then you start getting into like sound effects. Like you don't necessarily need sound effects in a prototype, but like when you actually make the game, you just make like 100 sound effects. And that actually was that was actually probably one of the more difficult things for me, because when I started the project, I actually already had some art background and some Photoshop background and programming background, but I had no audio or audio mixing background. So actually learning the tools like Audacity and finding like assets to mix and making assets was actually like a pretty interesting challenge that I was not fully prepared for at first. But actually I did ultimately enjoy it. But at first I was like, my brain like was exploding. It was like so hard for me to figure out the audio stuff.
Yeah, I use Audacity and other DAWs quite frequently, and at times it's just there are so many buttons that do so many different things that I just look at and think I don't know what that does. I'm just going to leave it alone. I will use distortion. I will use distortion, amplitude, and tempo, and that is it.
And also just like, does this sound good?
Yeah.
Like, does this panther sound like a panther, or this eagle sound like an eagle? That's like, sometimes you just like, you don't have the experience, and it's just like, you develop the experience, of course, like nobody's born with it, but it takes a lot of effort when you're in that time and you're like, okay, I didn't expect to spend 100 hours making audio sound effects, you know?
Absolutely. I mean, we'll come on to the future project in a second because I want to talk about this future project. But in terms of Boris the Sloth, are there any plans for a future for this really awesome game?
I think at this point, the project's run its course. If I think there could be a future for it if there was like an uptick in popularity of the current version.
Yeah.
I think at its current setup, I don't perceive that I would make a second one. Although it's like, I like the character and I definitely enjoyed the game.
Yeah.
But maybe I would make it a different genre if I was going to do another one. I don't know that I would do a puzzle platformer. Maybe I would do something just completely different. And I think that's probably like a smart idea, just because that's one of the challenges of being an indie dev is there's already quite a few puzzle platformers. So the competition is high. So I totally understand it, but I have considered making like a casual game, because for whatever reason, people really love the falling realistic sloth animation. So I was like, okay, maybe I'll make a casual mobile game or something with like with the falling realistic sloth, because it just is like hilarious.
Be the next Flappy Bird, you wait.
Yeah, exactly.
So in terms of like future projects, then you're planning this UI game. Obviously, I'm assuming it's early development at the moment. Can you tell us much about it?
Yeah, actually it's released. I just basically I spent all this time making Boris the Sloth over a year, probably like over several thousand or 1,000 at least hours of work. So after that project was done, I was like, okay, I don't want it to be the person that only releases one game ever and is done. I want to like prove to myself that I can make a project and release a small project. So I had this idea. It's called Manager Simulator, and it's just a mobile game. It's on iOS and Android. It's basically just like a quirky matching game where the boss is just like a jerk. And so as you
Very
like
relatable.
make mistakes, yeah, exactly. So as you get through like if you make a mistake, or as you get through different mini levels, he just kind of like says horrible things to you. And it's just kind of like that's kind of like the premise of the game. And it's kind of funny because it has like little mini games on the like in between levels where you can like break his mug, or
nice.
There's like Whack-A-Manager, so he like moves up and down and bobs and you have to like whack him. So
all
it's kind of funny.
All those things we wish we could do to managers that have been mean to us in our lives, you've now given us the opportunity to do in a game.
Yeah, brilliant. Exactly. So that was kind of, and that kind of started just because I really wanted to make something not related and just like kind of a side project as for fun. And I think that project is done, and I'm kind of done working that one as well. I do perceive that I will make some game in the future. Not 100% sure what it will look like. I kind of want to like get the inspiration for it, and I don't want to like jump too fast into another project, because Boris the Sloth was a full-time project for over a year, and I want to like take some time. Also, my wife will probably kill me if I spend that much time on a game ever again. She always says like she can't even like play the game because it's like too much. She's just too much animosity around Boris.
Lesser. I mean, to be fair, if you've worked on it like, you know, so much, you know, obviously a lot of time was gone into the development of this game, and that comes across when you're playing it as well. I could kind of see where she's coming from.
Yeah.
But I also, from a gamer perspective, I'm like, it's a really good game, so it's fine.
She will. She'll play it probably in like a year or something when it's worn off.
Brilliant. Oh, well, we are really excited to see more from you at Clutch Dynamics. I genuinely am. You know, Boris the Sloth has got me like thinking, oh, what is going to happen next? I'm going to check out that the Mean Manager Simulator game, because that just sounds like it's going to be a barrel of laughs. But yeah, Ben, it has been absolutely wonderful having you on the show. Thank you so much for coming on.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. It's been great.
Oh, you're welcome. And where can our lovely viewers find you? Obviously, we'll put some links down in the description, but where is the best place to find out more news from yourself, Boris, and Clutch Dynamics?
Probably the best is at Sloth Game Guy. So at Sloth Game Guy, and I'm on Twitter, I'm on TikTok, and I am on Instagram. Awesome. Or you can go to my website, Clutch Dynamics with a dash in between.com. And that's actually where I kind of list all my projects and the donations and stuff for sloth research and stuff like that. You can find it all there as well.
Brilliant. Honestly, thank you so much for coming on. Like I said, it's been wonderful having you. And yeah, please do go and check out Boris the Sloth if you've not already, because it is a brilliant game that, you know, as we've discussed, has got some brilliant ironic humor, some amazing mechanics, and is just all round fun. And if you like this video, why please do hit that like button and subscribe to Robot Republic for new content nearly every single day now, because we've got loads of content. Ben, it's been a pleasure. Thank you very much for coming on.
Yes, thank you so much.
And we'll see you next time, guys. Bye.